What if the most dangerous Soviet spy in America wasn't operating in the Pentagon, but in a summer camp? And what if his recruits were 12 years old? In the summer of 1983, kids splashed in lakes, sang around campfires, and unknowingly became part of one of the most disturbing intelligence operations of the Cold War. The counselor who led it wasn't there to teach crafts. He was building a generation of influence. And by the time the truth came out, the operation had been buried for decades, and the spy had vanished. Tucked away in the dense, pine-swept hills of upstate New York, far from the churn of cities and the hum of government offices, stood Camp Whispering Pines, a secluded summer program that since its founding in 1958 had earned a sterling reputation among the elite families of Washington, D.C. and beyond. Set beside a pristine lake and surrounded by towering trees that muffled the outside world like velvet curtains, the camp had long offered the children of diplomats, military officers, intelligence analysts, and Ivy League professors a chance to breathe, to explore, and to bond with others whose lives were just as exceptional as their own. Here, on the winding trails and in the rustic cabins, the children of Cold War warriors played volleyball and swam in the sun-dappled lake, while counselors from around the world guided them in lessons on leadership, ethics, international affairs, and the supposed ideals of peaceful cooperation. It was, in name and appearance, an international cultural exchange, a vision that masked its quiet exclusivity and made it an ideal place for American parents with security clearances to send their children without fear, until the summer of 1983, when a new name appeared on the staff roster. Viktor Alexeyev, age 42, nationality listed as Soviet-born, now Canadian, joined as a late-season replacement for the departing debate instructor, and while no one seemed to know much about him, his calm demeanor, soft baritone voice, and sophisticated mannerisms made him an instant curiosity among the returning staff and an instant favorite among the children. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, pressed linen shirts, and brought with him a weathered copy of Tolstoy's War and Peace that he often read at dusk by the campfire, quoting passages and inviting the more precocious campers to debate the moral failings of Napoleon or the illusions of heroism. To the other counselors, he was charming and unthreatening, volunteering for duty, counseling children through homesickness with unusual empathy, and suggesting complex team-building exercises that were oddly effective. But unknown to them, unknown to even the camp director who had been recommended Victor by a friend in a distant education nonprofit. His name was an alias, his citizenship a forgery, and his presence the result of a years-long Soviet plan that traced back to a classified 1979 directive within Department P of the KGB's first chief directorate. Deep in the Lubyanka archives, buried under layers of code names and falsified personnel files, Viktor Alexeyev's real identity, Major Viktor Lebedev, cultural operative, ideological strategist, fluent in 5 languages and trained in psychological influence operations, was recorded alongside a single mission objective: assess, groom, and report on the ideological dispositions of youth with access to future strategic infrastructure. And so, as the sun rose over Camp Whispering Pines and parents dropped their children off with hugs and promises to write, Victor stood by the welcome banner with his hands folded behind his back, smiling softly at the next generation of America's elite, who, unbeknownst to anyone, were now entering the first stage of a silent operation that would take decades to unravel. By the second week of July, the name on every camper's lips was Victor, and not just among the bright-eyed 10-year-olds or the shy bookworms who clung to the margins of the hiking groups. No, even the oldest teens, the ones who usually scoffed at counselors and spoke in sarcasm and shrugs, were gravitating toward him like metal to a magnet, drawn not by any forced authority or fake enthusiasm, but by the calm weight of his presence and the unsettling depth of his questions. Victor taught chess down by the mess hall porch each afternoon, where the sun filtered through the pine branches and made the white and black pieces glow like relics. But unlike the usual counselors who praised quick wins or clever gambits, Victor was interested in the way his students thought. He asked why they sacrificed their bishops so early, what they feared when castling too soon, what it meant, metaphorically, to play defense. At night, he would gather the older campers in a loose circle by the fire pit, after lights out, never mandatory, always quiet, always softly lit, where they would sit cross-legged in the dirt and listened to him tell stories, not ghost stories or tall tales, but recollections that felt real, visceral, sometimes funny, and sometimes haunted. He spoke of places he had seen, bomb shelters in East Berlin, bread lines in Bucharest, the silent beauty of a Moscow snowfall during rationing. And when asked if he had been a soldier, he only smiled and said, "I've seen many uniforms, but none that made men more honest." The stories were always just indirect enough to avoid scrutiny, framed like parables with a touch of mystery, and the campers leaned in, hanging on his every word. But it was the questions that marked him. "What makes a country great?" he asked one evening, staring into the flames. "Is it wealth, weapons, or something harder to measure?" Another night, after a camper lamented a family member's strict military upbringing, Victor posed a new one. Can loyalty exist without freedom, or is obedience only valuable when freely given? These weren't leading questions. They were invitations, open doors into murky thoughts most of these kids had never dared to explore. He never gave his own answers, never corrected, just listened, nodded, offered a new lens through which to see. It was intoxicating to minds bred on structure, medals, and Cold War certainty. Slowly those talks became sacred rituals. Campers skipped capture the flag games to claim spots near Victor. Even kids known for mocking deep talk found themselves lingering, asking things like, "Do you think war is inevitable?" Or, "What if we're wrong about being the good guys?" The counselors noticed the trend but shrugged it off. Better the kids be engaged with a smart mentor than homesick or causing trouble. The camp director praised Victor's positive impact in weekly reports. No one questioned how quickly he had become central. No one saw the subtle shaping taking place. And Victor? He merely listened, guided, and noted what each child revealed, carefully, attentively, recording not only what they said, but how they thought. And in his quiet, watchful mind, a map was already forming. While the counselors played frisbee in the meadow and the children sang off key at the talent show, Victor observed everything with the quiet attentiveness of a botanist cataloging the hidden structure of a forest. He wasn't interested in noise, but in patterns, and what others mistook for kindness or curiosity was, in fact, the mask of a methodical operation unfolding beneath every interaction. He kept no journal in the traditional sense, too risky, too obvious, but he did keep a mental filing cabinet sharper than any ink could render, and each night, after his discussion circles dispersed and the coals of the fire hissed into darkness, Victor would retreat to his cabin, slip into the back room, and begin to write. Not in English, not even in Russian, but in a cipher derived from an old Czechist code structure, one he had memorized, modified, and embedded so deeply into his routines that it had become second nature. Each letter was framed as a report to the Society for Cross-Cultural Learning and Friendship, the nonprofit organization that had officially funded his travel, provided scholarship grants for a quarter of the camp's low-income but academically gifted attendees, and operated under the generous guise of fostering international harmony between young minds. But inside the letters were no stories about games or group hikes. Inside were names, ages, behavioral patterns, family dynamics, and observations so precise they bordered on the clinical. Subject 14, Anna R., 13, high cognitive function, isolation from peers, recurring expressions of ideological skepticism. What if governments aren't meant to last forever? Mother deceased, father DOD, Mid-Atlantic Signals Division, potential target for long-term developmental grooming. Recommend reassessment at age 18. He rarely wrote more than 4 or 5 such entries per night, but each was crafted with precision and loaded with subtlety, highlighting not patriotism, he didn't care about that, but the absence of it, or better yet, the shadow it cast in those who were too bright to follow without question. He looked for idealism unmoored from nationalism, for children who questioned authority not to rebel, but because something deep in them wanted better answers. Some had absentee parents, some had alcoholic ones, some were quiet geniuses who found no mirror in their peers, some just listened more than they spoke. He mapped each of them across a mental grid of categories: anti-authoritarian tendencies, susceptibility to counter-narratives, emotional volatility, philosophical depth, and loyalty dissonance. The youngest he logged as potential long-term assets, others as ideological amplifiers, still others as mere watchers of watchers. Each week, his letters were dropped off under the pretense of a supply run into the nearest town, where he handed them to a courier posing as a part-time librarian, an older man who smoked clove cigarettes and spoke very little. The letters made their way north into Canada, and from there through a diplomatic pouch to a building in Ottawa that no one dared surveil too closely. And so, while the campers roasted marshmallows and dreamed of space or politics or college, Viktor Lebedev sat behind his lantern, writing their futures, one quietly dangerous profile at a time. In the spring of 2011, Sam Whitaker was sitting in a glass-walled conference room in a DC tech firm when his assistant poked her head in and said there were two men in suits downstairs asking for him by name, FBI credentials, serious tone, no appointment, and a request for 10 minutes of his time. What started as an unexpected interruption quickly became the fulcrum on which his entire understanding of the past would pivot. Sam, now 39, with 2 published books on digital warfare, a consulting contract with the Department of Defense, and a top-secret clearance for cybersecurity infrastructure defense, had built his reputation on algorithms, not ideology. His world was logic and code, not Cold War shadows. So when the agents produced a folder and asked if he had ever attended something called Camp Whispering Pines in the summer of 1983, he squinted in confusion and said yes, but barely remembered it. It was a long time ago. He was just 11, a weird little kid obsessed. With satellites and chess, he hadn't thought about that place in decades. But then they opened the folder and laid out a declassified document marked KGB, Directorate S, Influence Asset Evaluation, 1983, Project UNOST, and there, printed in Cyrillic and translated beneath, was his name, Whitaker, Samuel J., Asset Potential, Intellectual Idealism with Authority, Skepticism, Early Stage Cultivation, Successful, Candidate for Latent Development. The word struck him like cold winter down the spine. Asset potential. What the hell did that mean? He looked at the pages, trying to explain it away. Mistaken identity. Another Sam Whitaker. Some kind of clerical anomaly in a declassified mess. But then they showed him the photo. A grainy black and white still, clearly taken from a surveillance file. Viktor Alexeyev, smiling gently at a campfire, surrounded by cross-legged kids. One of them unmistakably a younger Sam, arms wrapped around his knees, listening intently. "Do you recognize him?" one of the agents asked. Sam's stomach flipped. He did. He remembered the voice, the chess games, the questions that didn't feel like questions, but like doors opening in his mind. Do you think power and truth always go together? What would you do if your country lost its way? He had quoted Tolstoy and asked about dreams. Sam had admired him, loved him, in that strange way kids do when they find an adult who listens like they matter. "That was a spy?" he asked, voice barely audible. The agents didn't nod or answer. They just turned the page to a memo detailing Project UNOST, a Soviet psychological operation aimed not at recruiting spies, but shaping minds, specifically young minds from influential families and intellectual lineages. Sam sat in silence, memories flooding back now with terrifying clarity. Late-night talks, the way Viktor always knew just what to say, how he'd left camp somehow feeling different, like someone had flipped a switch inside him. The agents handed him a packet and told him they'd be in touch. Sam closed the door behind them and stared out the window, haunted not by what Viktor had done, but by what he himself might have become. 3 days after the initial meeting, Sam Whitaker found himself seated in a nondescript conference room inside the J. Edgar Hoover building, facing a projector screen that glowed with the title, Operation UNOST, Directorate S Psychological Influence Directive, 1981 to 1986, and what followed over the next 2 hours unraveled everything he thought he knew about the Cold War, about espionage, about his own childhood, and most disturbingly, about free will. The agents, now joined by a woman from the CIA's Counterintelligence Center, walked Sam through a presentation compiled from thousands of pages of declassified Soviet intelligence files, painstakingly translated and cross-referenced, detailing one of the most audacious and insidious programs the KGB ever attempted, Operation UNOST, named after the Russian word for youth, a long-term influence initiative engineered not to recruit child spies, but to subtly and gradually shape the worldviews of elite American children, before they even knew who they were becoming. The files revealed that between 1981 and 1986, the KGB deployed specially trained operatives into educational and cultural exchange programs across the United States, focusing on elite environments where access to future leaders, political, academic, military, was statistically concentrated. The goal was ideological seeding, identify children with strategic lineage, intellectual depth, and a hint of disillusionment, and nudge them, not radically, not obviously, but gently, toward doubt, toward empathy with alternative systems, toward a worldview that would, decades later, manifest in subtle bias, policy shifts, or even decisions made in rooms where national security was at stake. This wasn't about turning kids into moles, the CIA analyst explained. It was about turning them into sympathetic variables. Viktor Alexeyev, whose real name was confirmed as Major Viktor Lebedev, was a pioneer of the strategy, an influence operative who specialized in what the Soviets called soft behavioral sculpting. His job at Camp Whispering Pines had been to plant the seed, not to reap the crop. According to the reports, he had profiled over 60 children in 3 summers, creating deep psychological maps sent back to Moscow for future monitoring and potential re-engagement through harmless mentorship, academic scholarships, think tank placements, or other subtle channels. What stunned Sam wasn't just the sophistication of it, it was the accuracy. One chart on the wall showed a list of names, 20 former campers, now adults, who held positions in federal agencies, law firms with state secrets, global tech firms. Their careers had nothing in common, except for that one shared summer. "You were flagged early," the FBI agent said. "We believe you were a top-tier influence candidate, one of his most promising." Sam remembered the conversations, how Victor had spoken not in answers, but in questions, how he'd introduced ideas without ever labeling them. What if loyalty required dissent, he had once asked? What if patriotism meant changing the country, not defending it? Sam had thought those were his thoughts, his evolution, his intellectual journey. But now he wasn't so sure, because what Operation UNOST had proven was that the most dangerous weapon in the Cold War wasn't a bomb or a bullet. It was a question placed in the mind of a child, with the patience to wait 30 years for the answer. The documents arrived in a sealed archive box, one of 6 unclassified in 2010, as part of a broader intelligence sharing agreement between the U.S. and post-Soviet Russian Federation. And when the FBI analysts opened them, they discovered not just the bones of a program, but its living nervous system, dozens of handwritten profiles, all authored in a meticulous, looping Cyrillic script, each marked with an ID number, a pseudonym, and, most chilling of all, a psychological trajectory. It was Viktor Lebedev's private fieldwork, a set of documents never meant to leave Lubyanka, mapping the minds of over 60 American children he had personally evaluated, sorted, and projected forward based on traits like moral flexibility, ideological plasticity, and what he labeled controlne yadro, the control core, or the mental anchor that could either resist or absorb foreign frameworks. Each child had been given a silent code designation, like Aspen 3 or Cobalt 11, with notes written in the kind of shorthand known only to operatives fluent in both psychology and strategy. Father, DoD satellite comms, questions U.S. role in Latin America, dreams of systemic reform, track at 10-year interval. The files had been dormant since 1986, buried when the Soviet Union's inner programs collapsed, but now, decades later, the map they formed had terrifying relevance. By 1995, at least 15 of the profiled campers had reached notable positions, 2 in State Department analysis teams, 1 as a Pentagon legal advisor, 1 in aerospace systems security, and several others with careers in federal judiciary or multinational consulting firms dealing in critical infrastructure. The Bureau cross-referenced career data, social ties, and public statements, and while nothing directly incriminating surfaced, a strange trend emerged. A shared tendency toward policy skepticism, a pattern of public writing or speeches that favored global cooperation over national interest, and, in more than one case, a published argument against certain military expansions that mirrored phrasing found in Victor's debrief notes. Most disturbing wasn't what these individuals had done, but how they had thought, and how that thought bore the fingerprints of conversations no one remembered recording. Interviews conducted in secret revealed fragmented recollections. Campers remembering a quiet Russian guy who talked about literature, or someone who made me feel understood when I hated my dad's military career, or in Sam Whitaker's case, the first adult who ever told me doubt wasn't disloyal. Others had no memory at all of Victor, but their profiles matched perfectly with what Lebedev had predicted. The CIA began to quietly circulate what they now called the map, a visual overlay of Victor's targets and their real-world careers, color-coded not by threat level, but by ideological deviation. Not spies, not agents, but something potentially more dangerous. Decision-makers who never knew they'd been touched, shaped subtly in the soft summer of 1983, carrying within them not treason, but influence, untraceable, deniable, and planted at the perfect depth to flower long after the man who planted it had vanished into history. The question the analysts now faced wasn't who these people were, but whether they still belonged to themselves. By late 2011, after months of internal memos, closed-door briefings, and a mounting pile of unearthed Soviet documents translated line by line in a basement vault in Langley, the joint task force assigned to investigate Viktor Lebedev's legacy reached a sobering conclusion. There would be no indictments, no charges, no official inquiries, because legally no one had broken a single law. There were no intercepted transmissions, no hidden cameras, no secret codes passed on napkins, no files spirited out of government buildings by corrupted former campers turned traitors. There was only influence, and influence, the lawyers said, wasn't a crime. The Department of Justice quietly declined prosecution. The FBI's hands were tied. The only ones who remained engaged were the analysts and the counterintelligence officers, those trained not just to spot what could be proven, but what could not. And what they now faced was something disturbingly unprecedented. A psychological operation, without handlers, without bribes, without even a single active asset. The CIA gave it a name, the Ghost Network, a term whispered in classified memos and hush-tone conference calls, used to describe what Viktor Lebedev had left behind. Not a ring of spies, but a web of minds, gently nudged, not coerced, and now scattered across the very fabric of American influence. It's recruitment without consent, said one senior analyst, without even awareness. One internal document framed it this way: he didn't steal secrets, he planted perspectives. Then he walked away. Lebedev's brilliance hadn't been in deception, it had been in patience. He didn't ask children to betray their country. He asked them questions no one else had. He didn't recruit them. He rearranged the scaffolding of their thoughts, then left the structure to grow without further guidance. By the time they became policy advisors, judges, engineers, professors, he didn't need to make contact. The operation was already complete. It was psychological preloading, ideological inception, and it worked because it was undetectable, unprovable, and in some cases, even admirable. Who could fault a cybersecurity expert for championing international regulation on digital weapons? Who could question a legal advisor for emphasizing the moral implications of preemptive warfare? These weren't acts of treason. They were informed opinions held by free citizens in a democracy, and yet, buried in the margins of declassified Soviet field reports, the shape of those opinions had been described decades before they were ever spoken aloud. The intelligence community was paralyzed. They couldn't act without cause, but they couldn't ignore what they saw. A blueprint of psychological manipulation so refined it left no fingerprints, only shadows. The Ghost Network was a thing that couldn't be dismantled, because it existed only in memories, questions, and the invisible handprints on a generation of thinkers. Viktor Lebedev had shown the world a new kind of espionage, not built on betrayal, but on influence so subtle that even the influenced believed it was their own. And as the task force was quietly dissolved and its members reassigned, one memo remained, uncirculated, locked in a drawer beneath Level 5 at Langley. Its final line read, "If this is the future of espionage, then we are already decades behind." It was the summer of '98, and the 7th International Symposium on Moral Education and Post-Authoritarian Reconstruction was underway at the Charles University Faculty of Philosophy in Prague, a seemingly mundane gathering of scholars, educators, and policy theorists from across Eastern Europe and beyond, hosted in a lecture hall lined with stained glass windows and peeling communist-era plaster, where debates on curriculum reform and civic ethics took place over weak coffee and political caution. On the second day, during the late morning block, an academic listed in the program as Dr. Konstantin Belyaev of the New Institute for Humanist Pedagogy stepped up to the podium and delivered a quiet but riveting talk titled Moral Foundations in Transitional States, Reconstructing the Ethical Compass of a Disoriented Generation. He spoke in flawless English, with occasional inflections of Eastern European origin, though exactly which country was hard to place, and wore a simple, navy suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and a thin silver ring on his left hand. His presentation was elegant, understated, and deeply provocative, arguing that moral education in post-authoritarian societies should begin not with patriotic instruction, but with philosophical doubt, introducing Socratic questioning at the earliest stages of education to train minds for ethical ambiguity. Attendees described him as mesmerizing, the kind of speaker you don't notice until suddenly you're hanging on every word. And though he cited no personal history, no published works, and no institutional affiliations beyond the vague institute on his name badge, no one seemed to mind until 2 hours after his presentation, when a visiting American educational consultant, Dr. Laura Emery, sat down at a cafe and said aloud to her Czech counterpart, "That man reminded me so much of a counselor I had when I was a teenager." She didn't think much of it at the time, just a stray memory from a summer camp in 1983, but 2 weeks later, back in Washington, while reading a recently declassified CIA memo on Operation UNOST, she saw the face again, aged but unmistakable, in a surveillance photo attached to the file, Viktor Lebedev. She contacted the Bureau. By the time her report reached the Joint Counterintelligence Tasking Group, it triggered a scramble. A cable was sent to the U.S. Embassy in Prague. Czech intelligence was looped in. The conference organizers provided a video of the lecture and a list of registrants. Dr. Belyaev's passport number traced back to a Russian academic visa issued in Tallinn, Estonia, but the identity was clearly forged. Surveillance footage showed him leaving the Symposium Hotel 2 days later, carrying a single leather bag and walking east toward the metro. Agents attempted to intercept him at the station, but the crowd was dense and the cameras poorly positioned. He was last seen on the platform at Moostek, descending into the underground network, his posture upright, his stride unhurried. Then he vanished. No exit footage, no trace at airports, no digital record of departure. It was as if he had dissolved into the bricks of the city. To this day, it remains the last confirmed sighting of Viktor Lebedev, a ghost who re-emerged just long enough to give one final lecture on how to shape the minds of the next generation, then stepped once more into history's blind spot. In the summer of 1986, 3 years after Viktor Lebedev's final season at Camp Whispering Pines, the camp gates closed for what was officially described as budgetary and administrative restructuring, but those few who had access to classified interdepartmental memos knew that the reality was far murkier, infinitely more uncomfortable, and potentially devastating to the reputations of several federal agencies tasked with safeguarding the ideological security of the nation's elite youth. The camp, once a shining beacon of Cold War liberal internationalism, a place where the children of military officers, diplomats, intelligence officials, and high-ranking civil servants could mingle in the woods under the banner of cross-cultural harmony, had quietly become the focus of an internal Department of Education and Defense joint inquiry, triggered by a vague but disturbing tip that foreign ideological influence may have coached or shaped select participants during the early 1980s. The language of the memos was cautious, deliberately vague, riddled with euphemisms like perception drift, unauthorized pedagogical vectors, and potential vector deviation in youth programming. A paper trail, later sealed and buried in the National Archives under a security exemption clause, revealed that several red flags had begun to surface in 1985, when 2 separate intelligence briefings noted strikingly similar ideological positions being voiced by 2 young defense interns during a routine vetting process, both alumni of Whispering Pines, both recalling with intense fondness a counselor who taught them how to question power. That alone wasn't enough to launch a formal investigation, until a third case emerged involving the teenage son of a high-ranking Air Force general, who, during a closed family intelligence briefing, openly questioned the strategic morality of U.S. nuclear policy in language uncannily similar to phrasing found in recovered UNOS documents. Internal alarm bells rang louder, but without a smoking gun, no documented crimes, no known active assets, no confession or defection, no agency wanted to carry the shame of it admitting that a Soviet operative had embedded himself in a program so closely connected to the American national security ecosystem. In one blunt memo sent from a Department of State official to the Office of Youth Civic Programs, the conclusion was clear. The political cost of prosecuting a ghost outweighs the benefit of closure. Contain the legacy, dismantle the vehicle. So, the camp was defunded. The nonprofit that oversaw it was quietly disbanded under the guise of mismanaged grants. No press release was issued. The property was sold to a local development firm and left dormant, the building slowly surrendering to moss and disrepair. Parents were notified via form letter, citing shifting educational priorities and decreased enrollment. Not one word of the underlying concern, ideological subversion by a foreign intelligence officer, ever reached the public. And so, Camp Whispering Pines, the stage for one of the most sophisticated psychological operations of the Cold War, died not with a scandal or a scandalous trial, but with a shrug. Buried under paperwork and political embarrassment, its true legacy whispered only in locked rooms by men too ashamed to admit how easily a patient enemy had turned a summer camp into a battlefield of the mind. It was late October when Sam Whitaker returned to upstate New York, driving alone along the winding two-lane roads that once led to Camp Whispering Pines. Though the signs were gone now, and the gravel path to the old gate was half swallowed by weeds and silence, the kind of silence that sinks into your bones if you let it, the trees still stood tall, older now, stooped with time, their branches thinner, more brittle, like the memory of something once believed to be eternal. And as Sam parked beside the rusted chain-link fence that barely held itself upright, he realized he hadn't been back in over 30 years. Not since the summer of 1983, when a man with a soft voice and deeper eyes had changed the trajectory of his thoughts without ever touching him. The main lodge had collapsed in on itself, a rotting skeleton of beams and splintered floorboards, and the cabins were little more than moss-covered husks, their windows gaping open like the mouths of drowned things. But it was the fire pit he came for, the ring of stones at the edge of the lake, once the heart of the camp, now buried under lichen and dirt, half choked by roots and time. And as he knelt beside it, brushing away the wet leaves with one hand, a sound rose unbidden in his memory. Victor's voice, smooth and unhurried, saying, "Empires rise and fall, Sam, but ideas, they live forever." The words had meant something different back then, spoken under stars, surrounded by children who believed the future was a place you could steer by will alone. But now they felt like a prophecy, delivered by a man who had known exactly what he was doing. Sam sat for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just listening, to the wind, to the water, to the place inside himself where Victor's voice had never really gone quiet. No one had ever caught him. No one knew how far his influence had traveled. The map the CIA created had holes, blind spots, educated guesses wrapped in caution. And maybe that was part of it. Maybe Viktor Lebedev had never cared about controlling outcomes. Maybe he had only wanted to seed the ground, to embed a whisper so deep in a child's mind that it might surface years later during a vote, a crisis, a quiet moment of doubt. Sam had spent years wondering if he'd been compromised, if the choices he made had been his or planted like software inside a system he mistook for his own mind. But now, kneeling by the ruined fire pit, he understood something else. Victor didn't have to control the future. He only had to shape the lens through which the future would be viewed. That was the genius. That was the terror. Because some weapons don't explode. Some weapons echo, through memory, through conviction, through conversations you don't even realize you're still having, with a voice that spoke only once, but never truly left. And Sam, now older than Victor had been then, sat by the ashes, staring at a sky that hadn't changed, and wondered how many others were. Still out there, still hearing the echo, still wondering whose ideas they'd been living all along. If this story made you think twice about the power of influence and how history hides in the quietest places, share it with someone who remembers their childhood mentors. Because sometimes the most dangerous operations leave no trace, just echoes.